My straight roommate asked me to come home early. Then I saw what he had prepared: gay love story. Hello everyone, and welcome back. If you enjoy emotional gay love stories with romance, powerful twists, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing viewers from all over the world. Thank you for being here. Now let's dive into today's story. The scariest message is never the longest one. It is the one that makes your heart imagine 100 endings before you even make it home. I must have read Asher's text at least 25 times before I finally pushed my chair away from my desk. The glowing words on my phone refused to change no matter how often I blinked. Come home early. That was it. No explanation. No emoji. No follow-up. Just 4 ordinary words that somehow felt heavier than every conversation we had shared over the last 2 years. I glanced around the open office, pretending to focus on the unfinished logo design covering both of my monitors, but my attention had already left the building. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. Cars crawled through traffic, people hurried along crowded sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, and somewhere far below, life continued exactly as it always had. Mine, however, had quietly tilted off balance because Asher Sullivan never asked me to come home early. My roommate was many things: organized, dependable, calm enough to make airport security lines seem relaxing. If he texted me, it was usually because we needed milk, the internet bill was due, or someone had delivered a package while I was at work. He was not mysterious. He was not dramatic, which was exactly why this message unsettled me so much. I reached for my backpack almost on instinct before stopping myself. Maybe I was overthinking everything again. That would not exactly be new. I had built an entire personality around imagining worst-case scenarios. My therapist once jokingly told me I could prepare for disasters that did not even exist yet. Unfortunately, she was right. Within 30 seconds, my brain had already invented half a dozen explanations. Maybe Asher was moving out. Maybe he had finally met someone serious and wanted the apartment to himself. Maybe he had accidentally broken something valuable. Or maybe he had somehow figured out the one secret I had spent 2 years carefully hiding behind easy smiles and harmless jokes. For one impossible second, another thought hit me so hard that I actually stopped walking. What if he had found the old notebook hidden beneath my mattress? The one I had promised myself I would throw away at least a dozen times. The one filled with unfinished thoughts that slowly turned into quiet confessions. Most of the pages were never meant for anyone else to read, especially not him. If Asher had opened even one of them, he would have learned the truth I had spent 2 years pretending did not exist. That every ordinary morning beside him had quietly become my favorite part of every day. Suddenly, I was no longer afraid of what waited inside the apartment. I was afraid that he already knew who I really was. The secret that I had fallen in love with my straight roommate almost without noticing. It had not happened all at once. It happened in quiet pieces. The morning he remembered exactly how I liked my coffee after I had only mentioned it once. The night he waited up because he knew I hated riding the train home alone after dark. The weekend he spent 4 hours helping me assemble furniture even though neither of us had any idea what we were doing. Every ordinary act of kindness became another reason my heart quietly ignored my common sense. I never planned for any of it. I certainly never expected it. Loving someone who constantly referred to himself as straight felt less like chasing hope and more like carefully carrying a glass that had been cracked from the very beginning. You learned to hold it gently because you already knew how it would end if you squeezed too tightly. My phone buzzed again. My heartbeat jumped before I even looked. Another message from Asher. Drive safe. I will be here. That somehow made everything worse. Why reassure me? Unless something important was waiting? I shoved my laptop into my backpack, said a quick goodbye to my coworkers, and hurried toward the elevator. Every passing second stretched strangely, as though time itself had become uncertain. By the time I stepped outside, the cool October air brushed against my face, carrying the scent of roasted coffee from the cafe across the street and the distant sound of an elevated train rolling overhead. Normally, those familiar sounds made Chicago feel comforting. Today, they only reminded me that the world looked completely ordinary while my thoughts were quietly falling apart. I told myself this was probably nothing. Just another evening with my roommate. Just another walk back to the apartment we had shared for 2 years. But somewhere deep inside, beneath every logical explanation I tried to build, a single impossible feeling refused to disappear. Somehow, before I had even started walking home, I already knew that whatever waited behind our apartment door would change both of our lives forever. The train ride home usually gave me 20 quiet minutes to separate work from the rest of my life. That evening it became 20 minutes of inventing disasters. Every station we passed seemed to deliver a brand new possibility that somehow felt even worse than the last one. Maybe Asher had accepted a job in another city. Maybe he wanted to tell me he was moving in with a girlfriend. Maybe his parents were visiting unexpectedly and he needed the apartment to himself for the weekend. Every explanation sounded believable until another one immediately replaced it. My reflection drifted across the train window while downtown Chicago slowly gave way to familiar neighborhoods. I barely noticed the skyline anymore. Instead, I kept replaying the last few weeks in my head, searching for clues I might have missed. Had Asher been acting differently? Had he become quieter? Had I accidentally said something strange? My thoughts refused to settle. I unlocked my phone again and reread his messages even though I already knew every letter by heart. Come home early. Then later, drive safe. I will be here. Those final 4 words echoed louder than they should have. I will be here. It sounded reassuring, yet somehow made my pulse climb even faster. Asher never wasted words. If he chose them carefully, they probably mattered. Just across the aisle, an elderly couple sat quietly beside each other. The man reached over without saying a word and gently adjusted the scarf around his wife's neck after it slipped from her shoulder. She smiled without even looking at him, as though the gesture had become part of their everyday life years ago. No grand romance. No dramatic declaration. Just quiet care repeated so many times that it no longer needed words. For a brief second, I wondered what that kind of love felt like. What it was like to stop hiding. To stop pretending. To simply reach for the person who already felt like home. Then my phone vibrated softly in my hand again, and every impossible thought rushed back at once. The train doors slid open with their familiar chime, pulling me back into the present. I stepped onto the platform, adjusted my backpack, and started the 10-minute walk toward our apartment building. October had painted the sidewalks with scattered amber leaves that crunched softly beneath my sneakers. The air smelled like roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the corner cafe where Asher and I occasionally stopped on Saturday mornings. Normally, I would have smiled at those little routines. Tonight, every familiar place felt strangely distant, like I was walking through memories instead of my own neighborhood. I passed the small bookstore where Asher insisted on buying paper books instead of electronic ones because, according to him, stories deserved real pages. I passed the grocery store where we once spent 20 minutes debating which pasta sauce tasted closest to homemade. I even walked by the dog park where an overexcited golden retriever had knocked Asher onto the grass one summer afternoon, leaving both of us laughing so hard that complete strangers joined in. Every memory carried his face. Every corner reminded me why falling for him had been so effortless and so impossible at the same time. By the time our apartment building came into view, my stomach had tied itself into a knot. The brick walls looked exactly as they always had. Mrs. Jenkins was watering flowers on her balcony. Someone upstairs was practicing the piano badly enough to miss almost every third note. Life remained wonderfully ordinary, which somehow made my growing anxiety feel even more unreasonable. I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, hoping the extra minute would calm my thoughts. It did not. Each step echoed through the quiet stairwell until I reached the 3rd floor and stopped outside apartment 3B. My hand slipped into my jacket pocket, wrapping around my keys, but I hesitated before pulling them out. I took one slow breath and laughed softly at myself. "You are officially overreacting," I whispered under my breath. "It is probably nothing." Even as I said the words, I knew I did not believe them. Then I noticed something that instantly silenced every thought in my head. The apartment door was already unlocked. My fingers rested against the doorknob for a second before I slowly pushed it open. The apartment was completely dark. Not the comfortable darkness of an ordinary evening when someone simply had not turned on the lights yet, but the kind that made every familiar corner feel strangely unfamiliar. "Asher," I called softly, My voice disappeared into the silence without an answer. I stepped inside and carefully closed the door behind me. The gentle click of the lock echoed far louder than it should have. I frowned. Asher always left at least one lamp on whenever he knew I would be coming home after sunset. He claimed it made the apartment feel more welcoming. Tonight, nothing greeted me except silence. I reached toward the wall where the light switch should have been, but before my fingers touched it, a warm glow suddenly appeared from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. One lamp flickered to life, then another. Soft golden light slowly spilled across the living room, chasing away the shadows one quiet corner at a time. I stood perfectly still. It felt less like someone had turned on the lights and more like the apartment itself had awakened. My eyes wandered across the room, and almost immediately I realized something was different. The furniture had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just enough to feel intentional. The couch faced slightly more toward the windows. The small bookshelf beside the television looked unusually organized. Even the blanket my grandmother knitted years ago had been folded neatly instead of being tossed over the armrest where I usually left it. Then I noticed the first photograph. It sat inside a simple wooden frame on the coffee table. Asher and I were standing outside Wrigley Field wearing matching baseball caps, both laughing at something outside the camera. I remembered that afternoon perfectly because Asher had caught a foul ball and immediately handed it to a little girl sitting behind us without even thinking twice. I slowly picked up the frame, turning it over in my hands. It had not been there this morning. My attention shifted toward the bookshelf. Another framed photograph. Then another. A movie ticket carefully tucked beneath a glass paperweight. A coaster from the diner where we always ordered pancakes after grocery shopping. A faded parking receipt from our weekend trip to Wisconsin. My heart skipped. Those were not random decorations. They were pieces of our life together. Ordinary moments that somehow looked extraordinary simply because someone had chosen to remember them. I walked farther into the living room, almost afraid to breathe too loudly. Everywhere I looked, another memory quietly waited. The tiny ceramic mug I painted terribly at a neighborhood art fair and tried to throw away until Asher insisted it had character. I picked up the little mug with both hands, turning it over slowly. A tiny crack still ran along the bottom where I had dropped it before the paint was even dry. I thought I threw this away. I whispered before I could stop myself. For a second, I could almost hear Asher laughing again, insisting that imperfections were exactly what gave things character. My vision blurred, not because of the mug itself, but because someone had quietly decided that even my smallest, most forgettable moments were worth keeping. A receipt from the bookstore where he convinced me to buy a novel I ended up loving. Even the worn deck of playing cards we used during a winter power outage had been placed carefully beside a candle. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, just little fragments of 2 years that I never imagined anyone else considered important. My chest tightened with every step. This had taken time. Days, maybe weeks. Nobody could create something like this in one afternoon, which meant Asher had been planning it long before he sent that message. I turned slowly in a circle, trying to understand what I was seeing, when another detail caught my attention. A narrow trail of small warm lights stretched quietly down the hallway toward the bedrooms, almost like an invitation waiting patiently for me to follow. Before I could decide whether to call his name again, I heard the faint sound of careful footsteps approaching from somewhere beyond the soft golden light. The footsteps stopped just beyond the end of the hallway, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then Asher stepped into the warm amber light, his dark blue sweater slightly wrinkled as though he had changed clothes more than once before I arrived. I had seen him after exhausting workouts, long shifts at the gym, and stressful days when nothing seemed to go right, yet I had never seen him look nervous. His hands disappeared into his pockets before immediately coming back out again, unable to decide where they belonged. He smiled, then lost the smile almost as quickly. "You made it," he said quietly. I stared at him for a second before answering. "You asked me to." A soft laugh escaped him, but it sounded more relieved than amused. "I know." Another silence settled between us. It was not uncomfortable. It simply felt full, as though the apartment itself had been waiting for one of us to say the next sentence. I looked around the living room again before meeting his eyes. "Did you do all of this?" Asher followed my gaze toward the photographs and keepsakes scattered throughout the apartment. He nodded once. "Every part of it." "When?" I asked. "Over the last few weeks." His answer landed softly, yet it carried enough weight to leave me speechless. Weeks. That meant every evening, he claimed he was running late from work or staying after hours to organize equipment at the gym. He had actually been preparing this. My eyes drifted back to the photographs. Why? The question came out almost as a whisper. Asher looked at me for a long moment before turning toward the hallway again. Because there is something I want you to see. He started walking slowly, then glanced back as if making sure I would follow. I did without thinking. The trail of warm lights led us past my bedroom and stopped outside his room. The door was already open. I had been inside countless times before. We watched movies there during snowstorms, argued over fantasy football rankings, and spent lazy Sunday afternoons reading while music played quietly in the background. Tonight it hardly looked like the same room. His desk had been completely cleared except for a single wooden box resting in the center beneath a small lamp. The soft light made the polished wood glow against the otherwise simple furniture. Above the desk, an entire section of the wall had been transformed. Dozens of photographs covered it in careful rows, each one placed with impossible precision. Some had tiny handwritten dates beneath them. Others held little notes tucked into the corners. I stepped closer without realizing I had stopped breathing normally. Every picture captured something ordinary. Carrying groceries through the first snowfall after moving in together. Eating oversized slices of pizza on the apartment floor before we had bought a dining table. Laughing beside Lake Michigan during a windy summer afternoon. Decorating an embarrassingly small Christmas tree because neither of us wanted to spend money on a bigger one. In every photograph, I was smiling. Then something unexpected caught my attention. Asher was never looking at the camera. In every single picture, his eyes were quietly focused on me. My pulse stumbled. Once could have been an accident. Twice might have been coincidence. But dozens of photographs told a completely different story. I slowly turned toward him, struggling to find words that suddenly refused to exist. Asher stood a few feet away, watching my reaction with anxious eyes. "There is one more thing," he said gently, resting his fingertips on the wooden box without opening it. "Everything you have seen tonight explains what I remembered. What is inside this box explains why I could never forget." My eyes stayed fixed on the wooden box as Asher slowly lifted the lid, almost like he was afraid that opening it might somehow change everything between us forever. Inside were dozens of neatly stacked envelopes, each one carefully labeled with a date in his unmistakably precise handwriting. They were arranged in perfect order, from the oldest to the newest, as though someone had quietly documented an entire lifetime one ordinary day at a time. I looked up at him, unable to hide my confusion. "What are these?" My voice sounded quieter than I intended. Asher swallowed before answering. "Letters." He paused, then added, "Letters I wrote to you." My heartbeat seemed to miss an entire second. "To me?" He nodded. "Yes." I reached toward the top envelope, hesitating before touching it. The paper felt slightly worn along the edges, as though it had been opened and closed countless times. "You never gave them to me." Asher let out a slow breath. "I know." The room became impossibly still. Even the sounds of distant traffic beyond the apartment windows seemed to disappear. "Then why write them?" I finally asked. Asher rested one hand lightly against the edge of the desk, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly. "Because I could never say any of it out loud." Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. He carefully picked up the oldest envelope and turned it over before handing it toward me. This one was written 3 days after we moved in together. I accepted it gently, surprised by how much something so light could suddenly feel so heavy. Before I could open it, Asher smiled nervously and shook his head. "Not yet." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because if you read them before I explain, I do not think you will understand why they exist." I slowly placed the envelope back inside the box. There had to be 50 letters. Maybe 60. Every one represented a day he had chosen to write instead of speak. My eyes moved across the dates. Thanksgiving. My birthday. The weekend we drove to Wisconsin. The night we lost electricity during the snowstorm. The day my grandmother passed away. Every important moment from the last 2 years was there. I looked back at Asher, hardly recognizing the quiet man standing in front of me. "You remembered all of this?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I remember almost everything about us." Us. Such a simple word, yet it echoed through the room louder than anything else. My mind immediately searched for safer explanations. Maybe he meant us as roommates, as close friends, as two people who happened to build a comfortable routine together. But those explanations became harder to believe with every passing second. Asher gently rested his fingertips on another envelope without opening it. At first I thought these letters would help me organize my thoughts. He laughed softly, almost embarrassed. Instead, they made everything even more confusing. I watched him carefully. Confusing how? He looked down at the box before meeting my eyes again. Every time something important happened, I realized the first person I wanted to tell was you. Every time I had a good day, I wanted to celebrate with you. Every time something went wrong, I only felt better after talking to you. He exhaled slowly. So I kept writing because admitting those feelings out loud felt impossible. The warmth from the lamp painted soft shadows across his face, and for the first time since we met, Asher Sullivan looked completely unguarded. He was no longer the calm roommate who always seemed to have everything under control. He was simply a man standing in front of someone he deeply cared about, hoping the truth he had hidden inside a wooden box for 2 years would not become the reason he lost the most important person in his life. Asher remained silent for a long moment after his last sentence, almost as though he had finally reached the edge of something he could no longer hide behind. He picked up the oldest envelope again, turned it over in his hands, and this time slowly opened it. The paper inside had softened from being unfolded so many times. He looked down at the words before quietly reading them. Aloud. Day 3. My roommate somehow burned grilled cheese, apologized to the smoke alarm, and laughed so hard that I forgot I had been worrying about work all week. I think this apartment already feels less empty because he is here. My face warmed instantly. I remembered that afternoon. I had nearly ruined lunch, and Asher had spent the next 10 minutes teasing me about my impressive ability to overcook bread. Back then it had felt like an ordinary joke. Hearing him remember it now made it feel unexpectedly precious. He carefully folded the letter and reached for another. This one is from Thanksgiving. His voice remained calm, but I could hear emotion quietly hiding beneath every word. Miles insisted we should not spend the holiday alone, so he cooked dinner even though neither of us knew what we were doing. The turkey was dry, the mashed potatoes had too much salt, and somehow it became my favorite Thanksgiving. A quiet laugh escaped both of us. I could still picture that ridiculous meal and the pumpkin pie we accidentally bought instead of baking because we had completely forgotten dessert. Asher smiled for only a second before opening another letter. This one was after your grandmother passed away. He paused, taking a slow breath. You smiled at everyone that week. You told every person who asked that you were doing fine. Then you came home, sat on the living room floor, and stared out the window without saying a single word. I wanted to fix whatever was hurting you. I hated that I could not. My chest tightened. I had never told him how difficult that week truly was. Somehow he had seen everything anyway. Asher lowered the letter and looked directly into my eyes. That was the first time I realized my feelings scared me. I waited quietly. Because friends care, he continued. Roommates care. But what I felt went beyond that, and I did not know what to call it. He laughed softly at himself. So I called it confusion. His fingers brushed lightly across the stack of envelopes. Every time I convinced myself I was just imagining things, another letter appeared. He looked toward the photographs covering the wall. I told myself I was straight. Because that was the future I had always expected. I thought these feelings would disappear if I ignored them long enough. His smile became smaller, almost bittersweet. Instead, they became stronger every single day. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator somewhere beyond the bedroom faded into the background. Asher stepped a little closer, his expression completely open now. I stopped going on dates because nobody made me look forward to coming home the way you did. I stopped imagining my future with someone I had not met because every happy future somehow already included you. He reached for another envelope near the bottom of the stack and smiled sadly. I never planned to read this one, he admitted. It was the night I finally stopped calling it confusion. He unfolded the page carefully. Day 247. Tonight Miles fell asleep on the couch waiting for me to get home. He insisted he was not tired. He lasted 12 minutes. I stood there watching him longer than I should have. I could have woken him. Instead, I covered him with a blanket and turned off the television because somehow protecting his sleep felt more important than anything I had planned to do that night. That was the moment I stopped asking myself whether I loved him. From that night on, The only question left was whether I would ever be brave enough to tell him. He folded the letter with slow, careful hands before placing it back inside the box. He looked down for a heartbeat before finding the courage to meet my eyes again. I spent 2 years trying to write myself out of loving you, Miles. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Every letter was supposed to help me let go. Instead, every page became another reason I could not. And eventually, I realized the only thing more frightening than telling you the truth was spending the rest of my life pretending it was not true. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Asher's final words lingered in the quiet room, settling gently over every photograph, every letter, every forgotten memory that surrounded us. I searched his face, expecting to find uncertainty or regret, but all I found was honesty. It was almost overwhelming. I looked down at the stack of envelopes again, then back at the wall covered with moments I had never realized someone else treasured as deeply as I did. Suddenly, memories I had dismissed as ordinary began rearranging themselves into something entirely different. The morning I woke up late after working through the night, and somehow found a fresh cup of coffee waiting on the kitchen counter before I even left my room. I had assumed Asher simply made too much. The evening I complained that my office chair hurt my back, only to discover a brand new cushion on it 2 days later with no explanation. I thought he bought it because he was tired of hearing me complain. The winter storm that shut down half the city, when the apartment became freezing cold and Asher quietly handed me his favorite hoodie before pretending he was not cold himself. Every tiny gesture I had filed away under kindness suddenly demanded to be seen through a completely different lens. My thoughts raced backward through 2 years of shared mornings, late-night conversations, grocery runs, movie marathons, birthday dinners, and quiet weekends that had somehow become the happiest part of my life without me ever admitting why. I laughed softly to myself, almost in disbelief. I was an idiot, I whispered. Asher looked confused. What? I shook my head with an embarrassed smile. I kept telling myself you were just a really good roommate. He let out a nervous laugh. I kept telling myself the same thing. We both smiled, and somehow that simple exchange dissolved a layer of fear that had quietly existed between us for years. I looked at him again, seeing details I had always noticed but never allowed myself to interpret. The way he always remembered which cereal I liked without asking. The way he automatically matched his walking pace to mine whenever we crossed busy intersections. The way he never started watching the next episode of our favorite shows unless I was home, because, as he always claimed, it is more fun together. None of those moments had ever been dramatic. They were quiet, consistent, patient, the kind of care that never asked to be noticed because it had already become a habit. My chest tightened with a strange mixture of joy and regret. Do you know what I spent the last 2 years doing? I asked. Asher slowly shook his head. I laughed again, this time because the truth sounded almost unbelievable now. Every time you smiled at me, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Every time you remembered something small about me, I told myself you were simply thoughtful. Every time my heart wanted to hope, I reminded myself that you always called yourself straight. I lowered my eyes for a second before continuing, so I never let myself believe any of it. Silence settled gently between us once more, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. Asher stepped a little closer, his expression filled with quiet understanding instead of surprise. Neither of us had misunderstood the other because we did not care enough. We had misunderstood each other because we cared too much. We had both spent 2 years protecting a friendship we thought could never become anything else, never realizing we were protecting the very love we were both too afraid to name. The room felt smaller somehow, not because anything around us had changed, but because every wall now held a memory that suddenly carried a completely different meaning. I looked at Asher standing only a few feet away, and for the first time in 2 years, I stopped trying to convince myself that I was imagining the way he looked at me. There was no uncertainty left in his eyes now, only quiet hope. My heart had spent so long preparing for rejection that it did not know how to respond to the possibility of happiness. I let out a slow breath and smiled through the emotion gathering behind my eyes. Can I tell you something? I asked softly. Asher nodded immediately. Anything. I looked down at the wooden floor for a second before finding the courage to meet his gaze again. Do you remember the first month we lived together? He smiled. Most of it. I laughed quietly. I almost asked the landlord to move me into another apartment. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. Why? I shook my head with an embarrassed smile. Because I realized I was starting to like you much sooner than I should have, and I thought putting some distance between us would fix it. Asher stared at me without saying a word. Then every time I decided I should leave, you did something that made staying feel impossible to give up. I smiled as one memory after another quietly returned. You celebrated when I got promoted before I even had the chance to tell my parents. You stayed awake until midnight helping me finish a project that was never your responsibility. You remembered my birthday when I forgot to request the day off myself. I laughed softly. You even replaced my favorite coffee mug after I broke it and pretended it had somehow survived. Asher rubbed the back of his neck with an almost shy smile. I was hoping you would never notice. I noticed. My voice became gentler. I noticed everything. I took one careful step closer. I just never believed any of it could mean what I wanted it to mean. The silence between us no longer felt frightening. It felt patient, as though it had been waiting years for both of us to finally stop running from the same truth. Asher looked down briefly before speaking. So, what happens now? His question sounded almost childlike in its honesty, and it made my heart ache in the best possible way. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. Now I stopped pretending that you were only my roommate. A quiet laugh escaped him, full of relief instead of nervousness. I slowly reached toward him, giving him every chance to step away if he wanted to. Instead, he met me halfway. Our hands found each other naturally, fingers fitting together with the effortless familiarity built through hundreds of ordinary days. His hand was warm, steady, and reassuring. He looked down at our hands for a moment before lifting his eyes back to mine. I spent so much time being afraid that I would lose you, he whispered. I gently squeezed his hand. You almost lost 2 years instead. He nodded slowly, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. I know. We stood there surrounded by photographs, letters, and memories that had quietly witnessed a love neither of us had been brave enough to name. Then Asher smiled in a way I had never seen before, free from hesitation, and asked softly, Miles, if we stop being afraid today, do you think we could finally start being honest with tomorrow? For a few quiet seconds neither of us spoke. We simply stood there with our hands still intertwined, surrounded by the ordinary moments that had quietly carried us to this extraordinary evening. Then I smiled and answered the question that had been waiting between us for far too long. I think tomorrow starts right now. Asher closed his eyes briefly, and I watched months, maybe even years, of quiet worry disappear from his face. When he opened them again, the nervous tension was gone, replaced by a smile so genuine that it made the entire room feel brighter than any lamp ever could. He laughed softly, almost in disbelief. You have no idea how many times I imagined this conversation. I smiled back. Mine always ended with you telling me about some amazing woman you had met at the gym. Asher groaned dramatically and covered his face with one hand. I knew I should have stopped saying I was straight sooner. I laughed. That probably would have helped. He lowered his hand and looked at me with gentle sincerity. I was not lying because I wanted to hurt you. I was trying to understand myself. I kept thinking that if I ignored what I felt, everything would eventually make sense. I nodded. I know. The beautiful thing was that I truly did know. We had both spent years protecting each other from pain that never actually existed, while creating a different kind of sadness by refusing to speak honestly. Asher glanced toward the bedroom before looking back at me. There is one last surprise. I raised an eyebrow. There is still more? He smiled with quiet pride. Come on. We walked back into the dining area together, still holding hands without either of us feeling the need to explain it anymore. The table had been set with simple white dishes, warm bread wrapped in a clean towel, homemade pasta covered in tomato sauce, roasted vegetables, and a small chocolate cake waiting patiently in the center. 2 candles flickered softly beside it, filling the apartment with a warm golden glow. I looked at the meal, then back at Asher. You made all of this? He rubbed the back of his neck, smiling shyly. It took 3 attempts to get the sauce right, and I ruined 2 cakes before that one. I laughed so hard I had to wipe another tear from my eyes. You baked a cake? I watched several cooking videos, he admitted. Turns out they leave out how much flour ends up on the ceiling. That image alone made me laugh even harder. We sat down across from each other, talking through dinner the way we always had. Except this time, nothing needed to stay hidden. We talked about the letters, about the photographs, about the future neither of us had dared to imagine until now. Every conversation felt lighter because there was finally nothing left to pretend. Halfway through dinner, I looked around the apartment once more. The photographs still covered the wall. The wooden box still rested safely on Asher's desk. My crooked ceramic mug still sat proudly on the bookshelf exactly where he had placed it. Nothing about the apartment itself had changed. Yet somehow every room felt different. It no longer looked like a place where two strangers happened to split rent. It looked like a home built one ordinary day at a time through shared breakfasts, grocery trips, movie nights, laughter, difficult conversations, quiet support, and countless little acts of kindness that neither of us realized were becoming a love story. Asher reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand again. "Do you know why I asked you to come home early today?" he asked softly. I smiled. "Because you wanted me to see all of this." He shook his head. "That was only part of it." His eyes met mine with complete certainty. "I asked you to come home because I finally realized this apartment has never been the thing that felt like home. Home has always been the person I was waiting to share it with. I just needed enough courage to tell him before another ordinary day slipped away." I laughed quietly and shook my head. Looks like I was not the only one writing things I never had the courage to say. Asher looked at me with gentle confusion. "What do you mean?" I smiled. "There is an old notebook hidden beneath my mattress." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I started writing in it a long time ago. I kept telling myself I would throw it away. I never could." A soft smile slowly spread across his face. "Will you let me read it someday?" I reached across the table and gently took his hand again. "Someday," I whispered. "But tonight, I think we have already said everything that mattered." I looked at the man who had quietly loved me through 2 years of ordinary moments, and I finally understood that the happiest endings are never built from grand miracles. They are built from small kindnesses repeated every single day until two hearts become brave enough to call the same place home.